Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by the Logitech G935 headset.
After a month's delay, Assassin's Creed 3 Remastered is out on Switch, a package that includes AC Liberation much like the PS4 and Xbox One releases. But despite being on par in terms of sheer content, the visual features added on those consoles are sadly missing. The Switch version is advertised as a remaster, yes, and in one respect it is. But based on close comparison, as we'll see, the lighting, shadows and reflections are more in line with the last gen releases. Equally problematic is the fact that this version comes in with a 13.6GB overall install, far down from the 45GB on PS4 for example. Clearly cuts have been made on Switch, but where? And does it really affect the overall experience? Let's dig deeper and find out. Positives first, the big surprise is this game does run at a native 1920x1080 while running docked under a TV. From every sample shot I've tested so far, that's the recurring figure. And while you can't ever 100% rule out dynamic resolution, 1080p is certainly the most typical number. Either way, it's amazing to see such a huge boost over Wii U's native 720p, and it effectively brings it up to the level of base PS4 in terms of sheer pixel output. That's not to say it's perfect. The post-AA takes the clarity away and misses dithered elements with lots of subpixel detail. Other aspects like Switch's low-grade ambient occlusion and shadows introduce shimmer of their own as well. So despite the great start with that 1080p picture, the image just isn't as refined overall as PS4, as we'll cover later on. So what about Assassin's Creed Liberation? This is a curveball. As a game built for the Vita first, you'd expect it to translate neatly from one handheld to the next. In the end though, the Switch version uses a resolution of 1600x900, despite in theory being the less demanding game of the two here. The signs of that lower resolution show as well. On top of the patchy anti-aliasing method, there's a visible upscale from 900p that introduces more obvious stair-stepping. On the big screen, it has to be said, it does look rough. To make matters worse, Switch also has edge artifacts in motion, something we saw with Liberation on PS4 or Xbox One as well, adding a stippling effect to geometry as it pans past. As a technical review, it isn't glowing so far, but there is a silver lining in portable play. Both parts of this package run at a straight 1280x720 while played on the go, whether that's the main AC3 portion or Liberation. In comparison with docked, there isn't a lot else in it. The fact the resolution drops by such a huge margin next to the 1080p in AC3 has an interesting knock-on effect for frame rates. But the actual comparisons between the two in visual settings, the shadows, lighting and so on, otherwise shows very little else is changed. Barring a step back in texture filtering quality and a tweak to the resolution of depth of field, you otherwise get the same game on the go. All told, it also actually looks better suited for the handheld play. You get a native 1:1 pixel map for the Switch's panel in both cases, and the smaller screen size hides a lot of the game's rough points. The only other point here is with anti-aliasing. Liberation runs with no anti-aliasing whatsoever when played handheld on Switch, leaving pixels looking rather sharp and raw. There's thick white outlines on targeted enemies that reveal it, plus the very angular, geometric nature of the buildings, which were designed around the Vita's limits, all of which makes the stair-stepping more obvious. On the flip side, the main Assassin's Creed 3 part of the collection does keep a pass of post-AA engaged, and so rough edges do get treated there at least. To the comparisons then, and our first port of call is how it stacks up to base PS4. Here we have a version that essentially runs at a likewise 1080p resolution, but the differences elsewhere are many. Lighting is really the standout part. It's a wholesale change on PS4, which gets the more physically correct materials and lighting interactions, whether that's on faces, clothes or brickwork. Everything's changed. Switch by comparison plays it straight, and the extra tone mapping and bloom of the auditorium candles are also missing. You can't help but notice texture mapping up close on Hatham too misses out on the PS4 Remaster's higher res assets. So yes, for Switch the textures are much lower quality. Some of these differences might come down to preference. Not every change is an aesthetically pleasing one, and if you didn't like the remaster's revamped lighting, this might be a perk. There are parts which are clearly a downgrade though. The screen space, ambient occlusion, and shadows in general on Switch are very poor. AO especially is represented by low-grade, flickering blobs of shade in corners, and likewise there's a lot of sawtooth edging on background shadows in that intro. Neither of these are an issue on PS4. Next, there's the cuts that affect the open world. The Anvil Next engine was designed to stream in large environments seamlessly on last gen, and the challenge there was to minimize the appearance of pop-in. Switch inherits the same method as used on PS3 and 360, and so you'll see partially rendered elements in the distance fade in. It's culling giant triangles from plants, objects, and buildings until you get close, and creating this dithering effect. For last gen it didn't matter, but holding it up to closer scrutiny at 1080p, it does stick out, especially next to PS4. A side-by-side as we run through the Boston Harbour also shows NPC draw is affected, where the density and rendering range are both pruned back on Switch. Combined, it does leave the world looking more barren. One last part that is cut is screen space reflections. Switch basically reverts to the last gen style, which honestly still looks great. The water shader gives a great illusion of rippling waves on the ocean body, and while the reflections aren't accurate to the scene, it still looks decent. PS4 by comparison does use SSR, and it gives the water a full breadth of reflections, based on the camera's view. Honestly though, the implementation isn't the strongest we've seen. There's artifacting around edges, and you can see a gap between a passing object and where the reflection actually kicks in. SSR is a double-edged sword in this respect. A big bullet point for the other remastered editions, but Switch does miss out in this case. It's easy to see what we've missed compared to PS4, but there is an upside. A comparison with Nintendo's last console, the Wii U, really shows a better image on Switch, with high-grade shadows up close showing less dithering. Textures are the same across the board, and the lighting model is intact, with only a few small tweaks. Factor in the bump to 1080p, and it's not a bad deal at all. Curiously, the draw distance on shadows is worse on Switch though. This harbour flyby scene renders them in closer to the camera's path on the Wii U, but once drawn in, they do look improved with Nintendo's newer machine. So it's a mixed bag, but overall I'd say the Switch version gets away with a better image overall. It's Wii U grade visuals then, at a higher resolution and with better shadows, but what else? Well, Switch carries over a few small extras, like motion controls for aiming weapons, which works surprisingly well. There is a downside though. In bundling two games into a 13GB package on Switch, it's not just the textures that take a hit, but also the audio quality. You get heavily compressed audio from the start, and even the introduction music sounds muffled. Voice quality is noticeably pared back, while sound effects in general are lower bitrate than what we're used to from this game. Worse still, the audio channel crackles too, in transitions to cutscenes. But yes, overall the audio is noticeably pared back. Here's a sample of just the intro scene as an example. The problems sadly don't end there. Switch keeps many of the glitches of the last gen versions, notably in NPC animations. Here's one I hadn't seen before, something straight out of John Cleese's Ministry of Silly Walks. Again, it's hard to say whether this has been added on Switch or if it's just a hangover from the last gen releases, but clearly this is in need of a few patches. Next, there's aspects of the visuals which just look subpar, like the low-res backdrop during this brawl. Aspects of the lighting also have issues too. In cutscenes, characters' eyes are often unnaturally bright, and likewise for specific tufts of hair among cabin members. It all just looks a bit off and wrong, and shows this version really lacks polish as is. These are all admittedly superficial, skin-deep nitpicks, but one genuine game-breaking issue did come up on just my first mission. During an ambush, the depth of field effect fails to disengage after a cutscene, making it impossible to see anything. The fix is simply to restart the save, no big deal, but the fact this happens in the first few hours is a concern. This really shouldn't be the frequency we see this many visual glitches. My only hope is a patch or two are on their way, because as it stands, it's really disappointing. Okay, so how's the performance stacking up? Here's a quick refresher on what we had on PS4 and Xbox One. It's mostly 30fps locked in the harbour section for the former, and with some mid-20fps drops plus tearing on the latter. This is the standard to beat, but the fact is Switch is at least helped along by the removal of all those extra features. The lighting, SSR and higher grade shadows are all reverted back, giving Switch a fighting chance of holding 30fps. And moving to the dock play now, you can see it's mostly getting there. In direct comparison with the Wii U version for context, you can see Switch actually outperforms the last gen edition, and does it at 1080p rather than 720p to boot. It's far from perfect, of course. The real sting in the tail is that it still struggles to hold 30fps, and you are getting mid 20fps performance in bigger towns. The improvement there compared to Wii U is by 5 to 6 FPS, and the auditorium sequence boosts it by a whopping 10 FPS. It's an upgrade, and likely hangs on the faster CPU clock speeds on Switch, in handling all those hundreds of NPCs and streaming in scenery at the dock. What's worth stressing is this is still in need of improvement. Even walking around a small tavern on Switch has levels dropped to the low 20s, and that's with barely any action on screen. Comparisons against PS4 are obviously less flattering, where we did get a flat 30fps most of the way into the harbour section. There is a twist to this, in that everything we've seen so far is in docked play. But what happens when the game is forced to only render at 720p, albeit with low GPU clock speeds? The outlook is a little more positive, and comparing portable play to docked play shows better performance by 1 to 2 FPS while played on the move. It's certainly helped by the lower native res, though Switch is still at the mercy of the same CPU clock speeds, which are locked either side. All told, you are getting a slightly smoother experience in portable play though, and the drops are hidden all the more by playing it on a smaller screen. The final question then is, how does Liberation run? Bizarrely, playing docked on Switch has this game play out at an entirely unlocked frame rate. It means we can swing up to 40fps and down to near 20fps, a situation that's never ideal. Being already built for portable systems should have helped it along, and likewise dropping it to 900p. But no, we're still struggling to hold a 30fps line for this one. It's not helped by a lack of a 30fps cap too, though curiously this part is at least fixed by playing handheld. As another twist, Switch engages a 30fps cap in portable play alone, and so no doubt, you'll get the smoother playback this way. That about ties up all the loose ends we have. Switch is as ever the most interesting release of the group purely because of its unique Tegra X1 design. Every time the turnout is a complete mystery until we get hands on. What we now know is that Assassin's Creed 3 and even Liberation don't translate perfectly as is. It's the last gen release at heart, but the cutbacks are too obvious for me to recommend it. Sound compression is among the worst I've seen on the system, and at launch anyway, the glitches need addressing quite urgently. There's also some disappointment at the poor shadow work and draw distances, and likewise for the sub 30fps frame rate, but in my view you can mitigate some of this by playing handheld. As a portable experience, it's far more palatable on Switch. In that sense, the best you can say about it is there's no portable Assassin's Creed quite like it. Even so, this so-called remaster is still hard to recommend in its current state, unless Ubisoft sweeps in with a miracle patch to improve it. But that's all I have for today. A lot of ground to cover in one go, but hopefully it was useful in some way. If it was, feel free to give us a like or subscribe to support what we do at Digital Foundry. And as ever, hit the bell to get notifications as any video lands. To get the source file to this video and many more, be sure to check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. But until next time, thanks for watching.
Featuring 2.4 GHz wireless, 50mm Pro G audio drivers, and DTS Headphone X 2.0 surround sound technology under the hood, the G935 headset delivers the ultimate wireless audio solution for gamers, whether you're playing on PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, or mobile. Order yours today from Logitech G.